Welcome to Saturday's Warrior, where we talk all things BYU, Big 12, and of course, realignment. Over the last 2 or 3 months, we've been doing a segment called the ACC Spotlight, where we've been going around the ACC to have guests on to examine the viewpoints from each of the respective member schools on realignment and on their views on how they feel like it's all going to shake out and what they'd like to see happen. And today we are following that up with the perspective and viewpoint of the Big Ten Conference to see, okay, this is what the ACC thinks, but how does the Big Ten, how are they looking at it, and what do they expect out of it? Because obviously, Big Ten is a big driver on realignment and what we're going to see. And so, in order to discuss this today, we've got our friend JR from the College Huddle joining us. Welcome, JR.
Hey, thanks for having me, Trevor. Appreciate you having me on. I always am curious about what's going on with the conference expansion and realignment, all those things. So it's always nice to have a time to sit down and talk about it.
And it is always changing, even since you and I had first talked about getting together for this video. More news has come out, and so it feels like it's always changing. But I guess that's just to be expected at this point. Quickly, before we jump into our topic, I do want to say if you are interested in catching the rest of the ACC Spotlight and us talking with some of the other schools, getting their perspectives, I will attach the playlist in the show notes so you can catch that. But also, if your school isn't there and you'd like to see them on there, feel free to leave me a note in the comments of a podcast or a YouTuber that talks your school that you'd like me to reach out to them. Please drop their name. I certainly will do that. I want to continue to keep this conversation going. But as I mentioned, so we got JR here from the College Huddle. And real quick, for people that are new to joining us, can you fill us in a little bit on what the College Huddle is?
Yeah, the College Huddle is just like a group of network of whatever you want to call it, committee, whatever, of a bunch of different podcasts that cover college football teams and conferences. So we have our conference shows that happen every day on the College Huddle YouTube channel. Right now, we don't have a national show going, kind of dropped that for a little bit, but that'll be coming back soon. We'll be talking about all different kinds of national shows. And the biggest thing is on those main shows is that we get a bunch of different people on from other teams, other shows, things like that, to try to get them and their perspective. Because at the end of the day, we're all fans here. We're never going to get rid of bias. Like, you're never going to go watch a show and be like, oh, there's no bias in this show at all. It's never going to happen. So why not just lean into the bias and actually hear fans talk about their conference, talk about their team, and just enjoy the fact of our fandom, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we are. We're fans. Nobody's an expert on every little detail, every little thing. Obviously, we know our team's best, but just be a fan. Just have some good, wholesome conversation, and if you yell a little bit because you got a rivalry, it's all good. At the end of the day, we can just enjoy the conversation.
I mean, that's what college football and college sports in general is all about, right? The
Right.
various fandoms and the rivalries, and we love it. Which brings us to realignment. Obviously, those matchups, and you got you have schools and their fans that are now in conferences with brand new fan bases that they've had very little contact with before, and a lot of change. And so, just on a high level, before we zoom in on specifics on what's going on now, what is your take on all that's happened with realignment and all these new changes in college football right now?
Yeah, I haven't got to experience it in the season yet, so I'm curious how it'll go, like, once we have a season go by. But I was never really down on it like other people were. I know there were a lot of people talking about we're losing the regionality of college football and stuff like that, but I mean, in my opinion, we had already started losing that back in the 90s, right? When Penn State came to the Big Ten. Now, obviously, they were still kind of in that Midwest region a little bit, so it wasn't the biggest deal in the world. But then you added Rutgers and Maryland, where it's like, oh well, they should be more of ACC schools, but okay, they're in the Big Ten. It kind of works. And then all of a sudden, Missouri goes to the SEC, and you're like, well, how's this working out here? That's not really a Southern school. And then all of a sudden, you have Nebraska, who's even more Southern than Missouri, going to the Big Ten. You're like, hold on a minute, what's going on here? And at the end of the day, you kind of lost that regionality a little bit. Not too long ago when all these other teams were adding. And so when the Big Ten went out and they got Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, it was almost just kind of like, well, here we go. The regionality is completely gone and we're just going to go for it. Now it is completely gone now that Stanford and Cal are in the ACC. I don't know how it gets any less regional than that. But at the end of the day, I kind of embrace it a little bit because I enjoy getting to know other fan bases. I enjoy having other people in the conference that I can kind of talk to and get their perspective on. And that's one of the reasons I've started this Big Ten show for the College Huddle, is because I want to talk to and get the perspective from as many different fans in the conference as possible. And so now with doing this show, I love it. I have Washington fans on a Big Ten show. I never thought I would be getting a Washington fans reaction to Iowa. But here I am getting Rutgers talking about USC, and it's like, what in the world is going on? But it's so much fun. It's so crazy. And at the end of the day, I think if you just embrace it and just have it for what it is, it's a whole lot more fun than, being a negative Nancy and just sitting saying, I hate college football nowadays. But that's just the way I take it.
Well, I think my natural reaction is to be the old man yelling at people, get off my lawn kind of thing. And I'd love to see it stay the same. However, BYU, it's hard because BYU simultaneously has benefited, but also been, but also conversely impacted by all these changes as well. And so I'm like, on one hand, it's great because we got into the Big 12. On the other hand, the Big 12, and the whole landscape is completely changed. And so, but that's just the nature of it now. And like you said, you have to embrace it. And that's one of the things, at least from the Big 12 perspective, is you're really excited that we've got Brett Yormark at the helm of the conference, that he understands that change is happening and always looking for new ways to continue to grow. And partially because the Big 12 you have to adapt, or you're going to continue to fall further behind. And so, which is
I think Brett Yormark did some amazing stuff with uniting the conference, right? I mean, he was able to bring this Big 12 conference together and say, people are laughing at him for it when he said, like, we're going to make the Big 12 the best conference there possibly is. But at the end of the day, like, your conference teams are going to eat that up. They're like, oh yeah, we are going to be the best conference possible. We are going to, embrace this, and we're going to be just as big as the Big Ten and the SEC, and we can take some G5 schools and BYU and Cincinnati and Houston and turn them into these awesome, Power 4 schools, which they have. I mean, like, BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, they have the Power 4 status, and really, they're not that much indistinguishable between some other Power 4 schools out there. And I think that's kind of the power of the Big 12. And so I agree with you. I think Brett Yormark kind of gets a little bit more flack than he deserves, but I think he's running the conference well. And I think that he's embracing a lot of this stuff. Unlike the ACC, unfortunately, where I think they're still bickering with each other too much to really embrace and grow like they need to.
Yeah, the Big 12 is definitely, I think that is a uniting factor. Is it's a kind of a us against the world type of mentality, right? And it's really united the conference for the most part. I think there's one or two fan bases that are a little bit on the outs, but you mentioned
there's always going to be some of the negatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Teams that didn't want to be there in the first place, but we embrace it. And so you mentioned the ACC. Obviously, they're in the thick of things right now, and it really feels like that's the next shoe to drop with all the lawsuits going on, primarily FSU and Clemson, but then also some of those other big brands and a lot of teams that are feeling like, hey, we are falling behind financially. We are blue blood programs. We're big names. We're big brands. We should be there, with these other guys in the mix. And so, so we have the ACC. We know these guys want to get in, and there's the constant talk. Well, they're more regional. They make more sense for the SEC, and that's where their rivalries are. But then the Big Ten could make more sense because the Big Ten may want to expand their footprint. The SEC doesn't really need those schools. The Big Ten has something to gain. So When we look at the Big Ten perspective of realignment, like what is important? Because we hear all sorts of things and everyone pretends to know exactly, like, okay, here's what the Big Ten wants. Everyone talks about the AAC. Everyone talks about, well, maybe regionality. It used to be you wanted schools that were regional. Now it might be you want schools that get you into new regions and new markets. And so what is really the mindset there? I mean, because we look at the last wave of expansion, you brought in Oregon over, say, Stanford. Oregon was a big brand. Stanford, I mean, is in the Bay Area. That's a bigger market than the entire state of Oregon, right? But Oregon brings a bigger national brand, even though their academics aren't as good. So it kind of feels like this balancing act of, all these different factors. And so what do you think is going to come into play if and when the Big Ten does choose to expand and add more schools again?
Yeah, I think the Big Ten focuses on three things. I think number one is the geography, and it's not geography the way many people think, where it's like, keeping regionality. I truly think the Big Ten wants to be a national brand, a national conference where you are coast to coast, which we are coast to coast right now, but you're trying to even, I mean, have you ever played the board game Ticket to Ride? You ever
Yeah,
played
yeah.
that? Yeah, Ticket to Ride, where you're trying to go all the way across, and then it's like after you get done going all the way across, then you maybe go up and down America. If people don't play Ticket to Ride, they probably have no idea what I'm talking about right now. But essentially, the goal is to create a train all the way from California over to Connecticut, Maine, whatever it is, and then off that train, you try to go up and down America. You try to hit up in the North Dakotas, go down to Texas, and I think that's where the conference is at right now, where they have that coast to coast, right? They are Rutgers, Maryland, all the way over to Oregon, USC, all those places. Well, now I think you're going to start seeing them go up and down more. I think you could see Big Ten focusing on Florida. I think you could see them focusing on Texas. I think you could see the Big Ten focusing on even going up near the Northeast. I think honestly, you could see the Big Ten going after UConn someday. I'm not predicting it's going to happen now, but I could see a day where you see the Big Ten going after a school like UConn because they want that nationality to be able to say, this is who we are, this is where we're going. Another one is academics. I know that this is one that a lot of people just kind of gloss over. Listen, the Big Ten presidents are losing some power right now. And this is a way for the Big Ten presidents to kind of gain some power back. It's to say, we are going to control who can and can't be in the conference. And if you followed the Big Ten long enough, you know that AAU status is a big thing for Big Ten schools. Now, the only school that doesn't have it right now, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't checked on some of the other schools, but is Nebraska. Nebraska had it when they came in. They no longer have it now. From what I've been told, they're trying to get it back. We'll see. I don't think they got it back this last round. I need to check on that to be sure, but
I think so.
I don't think they got it back this last round. And so, in order to be added to the Big Ten, I think the presidents really value that AAU status, and that's something that I think honestly you're gonna have to come into the Big Ten, because this is the one power play that Big Ten presidents have left to be able to say, you need this. And I think the third thing is kind of what you were talking about there with like the TV market and stuff like that, is basically TV ratings, right? Are you in a big enough area, in a big enough market that you can provide TV ratings for the conference? I don't think people realize how much of a boost Rutgers gives to the Big Ten with their TV market. Being out there in New Jersey, being close enough to New York to be able to kind of have some of that New York TV market. I don't think people realize how beneficial that was for the Big Ten to add Rutgers. They kind of get laughed at a little bit, and sure, they've never really been a good football program. Greg Schiano's doing some good work there now. You might see him, have a good season this year, but at the end of the day, I think that this is something the Big Ten does truly look at and say, what is your TV market? How many eyeballs are you bringing to the conference every single week? Because that's going to only add to the money the conference is making and being able to give out to their schools.
Yeah, so you mentioned that about markets, and I know like Rutgers and Maryland, it was a big deal at the time because you had the Big 12 network, and you still have the network, but nowadays with more and more going streaming and media is not as localized as it once was. Do you think that major brands outweigh the market they're in, a la Oregon and Stanford? And just to make that comparison, do you think that that's more important to bring in a big time brand? Even let's say, I know you mentioned AAU, but putting AAU aside, let's say Clemson, for example, obviously a much bigger brand, than they bring more value through their brand than they do through the market that they come from. How do you think that's weighed?
I think honestly, it just goes back to the TV execs. I think honestly, the Big Ten is going to these TV execs. There's a reason they hired Tony Petitti, who was in TV for a long time, right? He was in communications TV for a long time. If I'm not mistaken, MLB, he had some connections there at one point. And I think at the end of the day, they are just looking to the TV execs and saying, which one are you going to value the most to pay for us? I agree with you. I think Clemson would be a big enough brand that, and they get watched enough that they would be somebody that the Big Ten would want to go after. But based on what I've heard, Clemson is not a school that the Big Ten wants to go after as much as some other schools, which is crazy to me because I would think, yes, not the biggest TV market in the world, but a bunch of people watch Clemson. A lot of people hate Clemson, so they want to watch Clemson lose. A lot of people love Clemson, so they want to watch Clemson win. But at the end of the day, I'm with you where it's like, yes, somebody might have a big TV market, but if they're not watched as much, maybe it's not as big of a deal. But those TV execs, those are the ones that make the decision. And sometimes for people like you and me that we're just on the outside, we're never going to be able to see what do these TV execs value exactly. Is it local? Is it brand? Who knows?
Okay, well, since we touched upon Clemson, what I mean, so those are the two. It seems like Florida State and Clemson are at the front of all this, and those are the two that are talked about the most. And Big Ten, SEC, where would they go? Now there's this rumor that's come out that the Big 12 has made a pitch to bring those schools to the Big 12 using private equity funds to help them close the gap financially with those big two conferences. I've also seen so much that those other two conferences have told Florida State and Clemson that they are not interested. I don't know how much or if any of that is true. I kind of believe that the Big 12, it seems on brand for Brett Yormark that he would make that pitch to Florida State and Clemson, and it doesn't hurt them to at least listen to it. So to say that they're in talks seems like you could say that, whether it's serious talks or not, and be truthful. But I've honestly been leaning towards, after having all these conversations, following the media, that Florida State and Clemson to the Big Ten felt like the most likely. Not a heavy favorite because they have a lot of scenarios, but that was kind of where I was leaning. And now I'm not so sure. And you're saying that you think Clemson is less likely. What do you think about Florida State? And I know AAU is a big thing, but I know that Florida State's also working very hard to get to that point to achieve AAU status. So would that, do you think that matters to whether they officially have it yet, or if they're like close to think that they'd be like, well, we had Nebraska.
Right. I think I was doing some research on this earlier, and I can't remember exactly where I read it from. I'll try to look it up here in a second so I can, validate it. But I'm pretty sure Florida State got rejected for AAU. And if Florida State gets rejected, like I was talking about earlier, these presidents, they don't like that their conference is just kind of being run by TV execs. Yes, being run by TV execs gets you more money, but I do think these presidents do want a little bit of power over their conference. And so if it is true that Florida State did not get AAU status, I think Big Ten probably looked at them and said, no thanks. And I don't know. Again, I have to check, but I think it's far more likely you're looking at a Miami being added to the Big Ten right now because they have that AAU status. I believe they were approved just last month or a year ago from last month, June 2023. So the fact that they have that AAU status, I actually think it makes more sense that Miami could be a team that comes to the Big Ten rather than a Florida State at this point. And some of this talk, I think some people just kind of talk about it being smoke and mirrors and clickbait and stuff like that. Some of this talk gets started by really important people, and I don't I don't think all of it's smoke and mirrors. I do think that there is a very real possibility that the Big Ten looked at Florida State and said, "You are not AAU, or you got rejected from AAU, and you are not going to be in the Big Ten."
Yeah. Do you think it would be enough to say, "Hey, we have a 5-year plan, and here's how we're going to get there," or do you think it's like, "Sorry, you're in or you're out"?
I don't think so. I don't think, even if they say we have this plan to get there, we're going to get it at some point. I don't think it will, because like I said, the presidents, I really think the presidents want some kind of power to be able to say this is who can and can't get into our conference. And every time I talk about this, I get people in the comment section calling me crazy. The Big Ten doesn't care about AAU anymore. Nebraska's not AAU. I get it. I know everybody has opinions on it, and there's nothing written in stone right now, so it's a hotly debated topic. But if you're just asking me my personal opinion, if Florida State is not an AAU member, even if they say we're going to be an AAU member a year from now, I don't think the Big Ten takes them.
Which I think is funny because you have Oregon, who's like technically AAU, but from what I've seen and information, which I'm not an expert on all of that, it they're like they just make the cut, but they do technically have that. Whereas you have other schools that might be even better academically in many regards or in most regards, but yet don't have that status, and that would be a differentiator. Which maybe that's where people have an issue. Do you like that is a sticking point for the conference?
Not really. I do think that it's important for the Big Ten to be a prestigious academic conference, and I do think there's something nice to that. But I'm not a fan of Michigan to like they are, where academics is such a big thing to them. Now, if you ask a Michigan fan, they love that. I shouldn't say all of their fan base. I have talked to some Michigan fans that like that there is that AAU status piece to it, because they do hold their academics in such a high regard. Which, I mean, you're a college, you should, right? But if you're just a normal football fan, maybe you don't hold it as high regard as some other people. But at the end of the day, I want my conference to have the biggest brand, to have the most nationality of anybody else. And so, unfortunately, if that means that we're adding, I don't know, Duke instead of Florida State, I'm not for that. I got mad respect for Duke as a basketball program, but Duke is nowhere on the level football program that Florida State is. And I think that the Big Ten would benefit far more from a Florida State, even if they don't have an AAU status coming into the Big Ten, than they would a team like Duke, who does have the AAU status.
Okay, so just talking the ACC, how would you rank or prioritize the schools from the ACC that you think, in terms of likelihood of making it to the Big Ten? Like, how would you think, like, the presidents, whatever, they make a list of targets from the ACC. They say, "Hey, if we get the chance, here are the schools we want." Who realistically do you think would be in the running, and who would be kind of their top priorities from that list?
Yeah, I think the three schools right now that you should look out for the the ACC to possibly lose to the Big Ten. Not predicting it to happen, but just those three schools right now. This stuff does kind of change monthly, so you're watching this a month from now, it might not be the same. But the three schools it looks like right now would be Miami, North Carolina, and Duke.
Interesting. Not UVA.
I think UVA is connected more to the SEC. The SEC really values the state college stuff. And Virginia is the primary state college of Virginia, or the headliner college, whatever you call it, for Virginia. And I think that at the end of the day, Virginia's probably going to get courted more by the SEC than they will the Big Ten.
Well, UNC is one that I think makes a lot of sense, maybe equal sense for both the SEC and the Big Ten. Do you think that they would have more interest in one conference over the other?
I don't know. I don't know what UNC fans think and what their administration quite believes. I do think that the Duke connection is going to be a big one. I do think kind of similar to the Washington Oregon thing, where that's a big rivalry, and they kind of want to stay together and keep that. I mean, UNC Duke, that's one of the biggest and best rivalries in all of college basketball, if not the best. And so, even though we're talking more football here, I do think at the end of the day, if North Carolina is set to go to the SEC, but the SEC says, no way, we're taking Duke. I don't know. I do think that North Carolina would, in some way, shape, or form, say, well, if the Big Ten is willing to take Duke, maybe. I mean,
Yeah, maybe.
I think that is ultimately going to be a big factor. Not the deciding factor, but I think it could be a big factor for what conference they choose to go to. And I think both conferences probably do want North Carolina.
Yeah, like you said, we're talking football because that's primarily what drives realignment. Obviously, the big revenue sport in college athletics, basketball being a distant second. But having what is the premier rivalry in college football and then the premier rivalry in college basketball, both in the same conference, would be pretty wild. Okay, so those are the three. Are there any other schools outside of the ACC that you think are on the Big Ten's radar for expansion?
They kind of got some talk a while back, and I guess I'll start with these two before this one because the other one I don't think is maybe as likely. I do think Notre Dame will be in the Big Ten someday. I don't know if I should have added them in the ACC discussion or not. They are so out there with whatever they're doing, independence versus ACC. So they would have been in my top three. They probably would have been number one on my top three if I was including them in the ACC. But Notre Dame, I do think, is going to be in the Big Ten at some point. I think the Big Ten wants them bad, and I think at the end of the day, once the money becomes too good, and once the college football playoffs become too tempting to win the conference, I think Notre Dame is eventually going to have to make that jump into a conference, and I think the Big Ten is just the most likely jump for them to make, especially with the problems the ACC is having right now. Stanford is another one that I do think eventually will come to the Big Ten. They are just such a academic program. I think that you already have USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington. It makes sense. I think that the reason they were turned down before was more because their partner was Cal. But I think if you partner up Notre Dame and Stanford, I could see that happening. I could see those two schools coming together to the Big Ten. And then my third, I'll give a third. It's kind of like a wild card, and probably won't be too popular with some people in the SEC. But I really think that there was some legitimate talk about Texas A&M possibly coming to the Big Ten. Texas A&M was told they would be the Texas school in the SEC, and then they added Texas. And I don't think Texas A&M is all that happy. And me as an Ohio State fan, I know this, better than some other people. But Ross Bjork, the new athletic director, came from Texas A&M to Ohio State, and I think he still has some connections over there to Texas A&M that possibly could bring them. I'm not predicting it to happen. I'm just saying it's a possibility, kind of like a dark horse to look out for, that could possibly bring them over to the Big Ten. And I think the thing that not everybody realizes is how much Gene Smith, the old athletic director for Ohio State, was involved in a lot of this conference realignment stuff. I don't know if Ross Bjork will be as involved as Gene Smith was, but rumors were Gene Smith was really running a lot of this stuff to happen. He really wanted a lot of this stuff to happen, was kind of the advocate for it in many ways. And so if Ross Bjork, if he picks up where Gene Smith left off, we could see Texas A&M in the Big Ten someday. Could see it.
Yeah, what's funny about that, a little ironic about it, is that of the two SEC Texas schools, I would have said that Texas would have been the better fit for the Big Ten. And I remember years ago, there were rumors, I don't know if there were any legs to it, but, rumors of Texas potentially joining the Big Ten. And then so if it ended up being the other way around, would be very interesting. But you mentioned Notre Dame. So it sounds like even after being rejected by Notre Dame time and again, it feels like the Big Ten would still take Notre Dame. But I think that's going to be, I think they've shown they will be independent as long as there is a viable path for them to make it to the playoff and they have a viable shot at getting into the national championship. So I think as long as that's there, we'll see how that continues to change with the playoff format and everything over the years. But yeah, eventually it feels like basically all of their major rivals will be in the Big Ten, especially, I mean, you mentioned Miami and Stanford even being candidates for potential additions to the conference. And so at some point, most of those brands will already be there, that it does seem like the most natural fit. I can't really see them, if they ever do join a conference, going elsewhere. What do you think of Kansas? Do you think there's any potential? I know that once upon a time, Kansas thought they were a shoo-in to get into the Big Ten. It hasn't manifested. You see little things every now and then going around on Twitter. Do you think that there's any chance that they ever get an invite, or they're just on the outs?
I think that their football brand expanding has definitely helped. I think that they've been a much more intriguing team. But at the end of the day, I think that Kansas probably fits the SEC better. Number one, that rivalry with Mizzou, I think, is much more real than some people realize. And I think that Kansas fans and Missouri fans would gladly welcome, playing every single year again and that kind of stuff. So I do think that's a piece of it. But like we talked about, the academics and some of those things, Kansas seems like a very good fit, and they would be an excellent part of the country for the Big Ten to go after. I don't know much about the Kansas TV market. I would think that it's doing okay, especially with basketball. But like you said, football really runs this stuff more than anything else. And they're kind of a toss-up for me. I could see it going either way. If you ask me to make an argument for Kansas to the SEC, I can make it. If you ask me to make an argument for Kansas to the Big Ten, I could make it. I could see it going either way. Honestly, it might just come down to Kansas's choice if both of them are courting them, and I kind of feel like they might choose the SEC, but that's just my lean right now. Could change tomorrow.
Yeah, and it probably will. Yeah, absolutely. So in all of this, do you think that the Big Ten is? I mean, there's a lot of conjecture that the Big Ten, if they could expand, they could continue to add schools. Do you think that they have appetite for more additions at this point,
I
or
think
is
the
that
Big
just a
Ten is,
fan invention?
yeah, I think the Big Ten does want to get to 22, 24 schools at
Okay.
some point. I think that the Big Ten looks at themselves and says there's power in numbers. Maybe we don't have Georgia. Maybe we don't have Alabama. But if we have North Carolina, if we have Miami, if we have Notre Dame, if we have Stanford, that's more national. That's going everywhere. And I do think at some point you could see the Big Ten putting together their own kind of pod system with playoffs or something like that. I think at the end of the day, the Big Ten is doing their best to put something together where they can be their own kind of league, right? And where it's them and, they have some kind of partnership with, the SEC or the Big 12 or something like that, something where they can kind of look at themselves that way. I don't know if I want that to happen. Again, I'll probably embrace whatever does happen just because I don't want to be one of those people that, gets mad when things change. Of course, I do get mad sometimes when things change. I just try my best to embrace it. But that's what it seems like to me. It seems like the Big Ten is trying to have power and numbers and create their own kind of league slash brand.
Do you think they'll break away in football, like from the NCAA?
I don't think they'll ever have enough power to break away from the SEC. And I think that the big piece of it will be, can the Big 12 stick with them? And I don't know if the Big 12 will ever make as much money as the Big 10 or the SEC does. But I think the Big 12, if they're able to hold on to enough of those schools that are really integral to a piece of college football, if they start losing schools and they're down to 10, 12 schools, it's unfortunate, but they could possibly become a little bit of an afterthought. Not rooting for that to happen. I like the Big 12 conference. I hope the Big 12 conference sticks around. It's one of the most competitive conferences out there. Every single year, you have no idea who's going to win that conference. And I think it's one of the most fun conferences to watch. But at the end of the day, if the Big 10 does start taking some teams from the Big 12 or something like that, or the SEC does, we could see something like that happen. But I don't think the Big 10 will ever lose that connection to the SEC. I think the SEC is too talented and there is too much good football being played at the high school level down in the South. And that benefits the Big 12 as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. Obviously, the Big 12 is working feverishly to try to remain relevant. And I'm glad you touched upon that in terms of having enough brands that still have something viable to the spirit of what is college football, because everyone sees what's happening with the Big Ten and the SEC, gobbling up all these major brands. But college football has always been more than that. It has been about the rivalries, which some of them have been reunited through all. These conferences are so big that you had Texas and A&M are now reunited or whatever. But you're also seeing things like Bedlam being torn apart and all these other rivalries. Oh yeah, the Holy War, even, we're back together. But other rivalries being torn apart. But it's also about the underdog, and it's always about that. No matter where you are, your team, your fan base has a piece of the action. And the way it's going is, you have these two conferences, and if that's all that matters, all these other people are, basically excluded from that. While you'll have the big brands, you'll have huge, obviously schools like Ohio State, Michigan, a lot of these SEC schools have huge fan bases, whether they're alumni or just bought into the brand. But there's a lot of other people that are going to be cut off, and I can't see them being that invested. And maybe some people still will. And so at what point does it become detrimental to almost be too big, where you have a lot of the big brands, but then you've cut off, a lot of these other teams. And I'm afraid of that's what's going to happen then. Like if it basically became a mini NFL between, you got two leagues, the Big Ten, SEC.
Right.
If I wanted to watch the NFL, I can watch the NFL. Do I need to watch these other schools, which I have no connection to, even though they're big brands? And so that's kind of what I think they're running the risk of. The other thing is that's really hard. And I know that BYU, because of a lot of factors, is not really in contention, not even on like the long list for Big Ten or SEC, probably for many reasons. But just seeing like the Big Ten has schools that are, you've got a Purdue, you've got Rutgers, that, some of them are there because legacy, some of them are there because of market, but aren't contributing. Where if you've other, like BYU has a national championship. Granted,
Right.
it's been a while, but BYU's been competitive. They've consistently ranked in the top 25 in and out over the years. Or, a lot of these other schools, Oklahoma State, TCU, you see a lot of that. And so that is, at least from the Big 12 perspective, one of the things we see. It's like, look, I'm kind of, even though Brett Yormark talks about trying to be number one, I'm kind of resigned to, okay, Big 12 can be the third best conference. But if at some point where it's just completely irrelevant, then that's where I worry about the sport of college athletics, football mainly, of just kind of being pushed aside and no longer mattering.
Yeah, at the end of last season, I was kind of making the prediction. To me, at some point, we would get the Big Ten having their own playoff structure and the SEC having their own playoff structure, and it would almost be like the NFC and the AFC, and you battle it out, and then the winner of each conference meets in the middle. I don't know if I see that as much as I once did. I think if somebody asked me for a prediction, I might still predict that. But I'm not as solid on that because I do think that there are aspects of the Big 12 that offers traditional college football that the SEC and the Big 10 will not be able to offer when they get large enough and they kind of turn into this, NFL light
Mm-hmm.
type of situation, which I don't want that to happen. I don't want college football to turn into NFL light. I think there is something very valuable, and like we've been talking about, the tradition, the rivalries, 3 stars going to some school and in that school, developing them, turning them into these, really good players, competing for a national championship, that kind of stuff. And I really feel like the best thing for the Big 12 to do right now is to establish some team as kind of like that dominant team in the conference. Because as much as I love the Big 12 and what they are, with anybody can win every year, the reason why the SEC has a lot of favor to it is because of teams like Alabama and Georgia. The reason why the Big 10 has a lot of favor to it is because of teams like Ohio State, Michigan, Oregon, right? These are teams that are going to be in the national title hunt every single year. The Big 12 can get a team in the national title hunt. Look at TCU a couple years ago. Now, granted, the national championship game didn't go the way they wanted, but they still took down Michigan, right? They were still able to take down one of the Big Ten teams. And so when Big Ten schools start talking about, oh, the Big 12 is the worst conference, you can say, well, TCU took you down. So, like, what are you going to do there? And so I really hope that the Big 12 does establish some kind of like alpha dog in that conference, whether it's Kansas State, BYU, Utah, TCU, Kansas, even. Who cares? I mean, at this point, establish some kind of alpha dog that is going to be in the top 5, top 8 rankings every single year, where they're going to say, this is a team you need to look out for that could win a national championship. And I think that could possibly put the Big 12 on the map enough to where you don't get this Big 10, SEC, NFC, AFC, meet in the middle, NFL light.
Yeah, and I'm torn on that because I completely understand that reasoning. Although I also think that the depth of the Big 12 and the competitiveness is what makes it entertaining. Obviously, it hurts postseason if you if everyone beats each other up and your best team is maybe 10 and I guess maybe they have the conference championship, so maybe they're 11-2 or something at that point. Maybe do they not get a bye in the first round or whatever? I don't know,
right?
Or 10-3, however. But yeah. So, but on the other hand, yeah, you want to be well positioned for the postseason, but how do you have that give and take? And also people keep saying, well, nobody wants the Big 12 schools. I was like, well, yeah, maybe because we don't have any one standout brand, but we have enough of very good brands. Whereas, growing up in Michigan, I was a casual Michigan fan, as kind of, considering they were definitely more entertaining than the Lions growing up. And, it's just been hard, though, to watch as much now because, if I like, oh, Michigan's on, let me watch. Who are they playing? Oh, it's Rutgers or, some very terrible teams until like one or two really good games, in the season. And then they play Iowa in the conference championship, whatever. And then, okay, great. They're in the playoff. Like that's fun. So it's like a lot of games. It's like you have a huge brand, but, a lot of also inventory, a lot of games that aren't entertaining. But then but at the same time, as you're mentioning, having those good brands, like how much does it benefit the Big Ten to continue to go out and can add really good quality brands if it's just going to make that path harder to get to the playoffs? So like right now, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, these schools have, other than each other, a relatively clear path to be in contention in the playoff, right? But then if you're throwing USC, Oregon, Miami, whoever, Clemson, Florida State, whoever, right? A&M, all in their path, then it gets a lot tougher. And so I guess to flip that around, yeah, that would benefit Big 12 in many ways to have one or two dominant programs. But these, the Big 10 and SEC, at what point does it not benefit them to keep adding these really good programs or programs that have potential to be, top of their conference?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think one of the ways the Big Ten looks at it, and it kind of is a throwback to what we were talking about earlier, is the money aspect to it, right? I mean, we would love for college football to be about winning and fandom and putting together the best team possible. But I mean, I know it's negative, but if I'm looking at it the most realistic way possible, what do these schools care about? It's money. And if you put as many schools as possible into one conference that has viewers and has people watching them, then that's going to be what the athletic departments care more about. It's not so much about who wins the national championship. It's what kind of check are we getting from our conference. And unfortunately, that's the piece of it that makes it more attractive for Florida State, to go to the Big Ten rather than the Big 12. Now, I think Florida State would flourish in the Big 12. I think that they're in a much better situation there. I think they're with some, better leadership in the conference, because we were talking about Brett Yormark earlier and how he's uniting the conference and bringing them together. I think that it would be possibly better for them as a program with their winning to be able to go to the Big 12, as long as the Big 12 is offered a spot into the playoffs, an automatic bid. I hope that never goes away. I love the conferences have that. But I'm with you. I think it's better for the Florida State, but I think at the end of the day, Florida State, Clemson, these schools, unfortunately, I don't think they look at it the same way fans do. I think they look at it and say, what kind of check are we getting? And not so much what kind of opportunity are we getting to win a national championship.
Yeah, and I get the Florida State Clemson perspective of, hey, even if the money's the same, and even if I feel like, maybe the Big 12 provides a clear path to the playoff, I think they're still going to lean towards the Big 10 or SEC because of the perception of those two conferences at this point.
Right.
And so it seems like that's where they would go. But to make your argument, that argument of, well, the Big 12, look, there might be a clear path because we don't have those same top dogs that maybe the other conferences have. So you could kind of come in and be that. Now, I would say that the Big 12 is deeper than the ACC, so their path to being that top dog was going to be more difficult. But on the other hand, they also don't have those one or two really, really, difficult games. They're not going up against the Alabama or something, or Florida, Georgia, every year.
Right.
Well, I guess Florida State is, but you know what I'm saying? So, but yeah, I don't think, I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens. That seems to be rumors of the Florida State and Clemson to the Big 12 seem to be picking up steam on social media. I don't know if I put a lot of stock in or how much stock I put into all of that. I believe those conversations are being had, but
I don't think they're nothing. I don't look at it and say it's absolutely nothing. It's just smoke and mirrors and clickbait. I think there's something there to it. That stuff doesn't get started just, because somebody has funsies on Twitter. That stuff gets started because there's some actual conversations going on. So I'm with you. I don't know if it's the most serious thing in the world, but there's got to be something to it.
Oh yeah, you had serious reporters that do good work that are talking about it. Now, how likely it is, I don't know. Whether it's picking up steam, It happens tomorrow. If it happened tomorrow, I'd be surprised. Although I guess nothing should surprise us at this point.
Nothing surprises us in conference realignment anymore.
So anyway, but out of all that, so you've mentioned some of your likely teams you think that would be biggest targets for the Big Ten. But let's say after this next round of realignment, let's say in the next 5 years, what additions, what do you think the Big Ten looks like in that time frame, and kind of the college conference landscape is at that point?
Yeah, so I think, if I was going to predict where the conference would go in this next form of realignment, it would probably be adding Notre Dame, Stanford, Miami, and throw another team in there, North Carolina, maybe Duke replaces somebody in there instead of Stanford or something like that. Like, 4 of those 5 teams that I mentioned come to the Big Ten. And then we look at, who are the next teams after that to round out the Big 10 to 24. Say that 24 number is where they want to get, and they're going to round it out there. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Big 10 try to go after some SEC schools, like we talked about with Texas A&M being a possibility. I wouldn't be surprised to see them do that. I wouldn't be surprised for them to go after a Big 12 school and say, I don't know, Utah. You're
They already think that they're a shoe-in for the Big Ten, and I
don't think they are. But that rumor was started a little while ago too, so who knows?
Last fall, Kyle Whittingham made some sort of, he was implying, this is only short term anyway. We'll go elsewhere. We know they're most likely not the SEC. They feel like they're AAU. They could really get into the Big Ten, and I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I'm saying the Big Ten's at 18. Depending on how big they get, your number that's thrown out a lot, you mentioned what also was 24. So that's 6 more spots. And I could name a number of schools that I think would be higher on the list than Utah to get in one of those 6 spots. Am I wrong on that? Or do you think?
No, I think you're right. Utah was just one that came to my mind that I know has the AAU, and they were rumored for a little bit with some of that stuff. But I think you're right. I mean, if we really dug deep into it and said, would the Big Ten prioritize this school over Utah, I think we could probably find at least a few. But I mean, that's what makes this question so interesting, right? Like, we're projecting, and then we're projecting on top of the projection of saying who are going to be the final 2 after they get to 22. all of this is just so crazy, but none of it is nonsense talk. I mean, all of this stuff could possibly happen. It might sound like nonsense to somebody who doesn't follow this stuff, but if you follow conference realignment at all, you're like, yep, JR, Trevor, Utah could go. Yep, Kansas could go to SEC. Texas A&M could go to the Big Ten. I don't know how likely it is, but it could happen.
Yeah, anything could happen. I just wanted that for the record in case there are any Utah fans that stumble upon the channel.
You don't want them getting big britches, huh?
Yeah. No, but I'm not saying it couldn't happen. For many ways, Utah could make sense for the Big Ten. I just think that there's other schools that would be a higher priority.
I agree. There probably are. Yeah.
And but you'd mentioned again A&M, and I meant to ask you this earlier. So A&M could switch from the SEC. You could go after SEC. You could go after Big 12 schools. But there was some smoke for a little bit about SEC potentially wanting to go after Nebraska. Do you think that that's likely, especially if they don't ever get their AAU status back, or how do you think that might go?
If they don't get their AAU status back, it could be a possibility. It could be a situation where SEC pushes and, I mean, it's like in recruiting where it's like, oh, we cooled on them, like one of those situations. And, maybe the Big Ten's like, oh, we cooled on Nebraska a little bit or something like that. I don't pretend to know about kicking teams out of the conference. I've never seen anything like that happen. But if you're asking me, the next round of realignment is not adding teams, but it's actually trying to get rid of teams, I couldn't say that it's impossible, right? I mean, anything is on the table at this point. Do I guess it would be Nebraska? I wouldn't think so. But if you have the SEC coming after them, courting them, and telling them how great they are, and they can come to the SEC, and the Big Ten was terrible for them, and that's when they had the worst years of their program, and they come to the SEC, and they can recruit well, and they can, put together a team that's going to win national championships, it could happen. But I definitely think if the Big Ten goes after the Texas A&M, you will see the SEC try to retaliate in some way, shape, or form. Whether that's Nebraska or whether that's Penn State. Who knows?
Yeah. Who knows at this point? So, okay, that's interesting. And do you see them ever? You talked about kicking out, you don't think it's likely, but if they do shed schools, do you think it would ever be, dead? I say dead weight, but legacy programs like this Purdue, or they're the easy one that I always throw under the bus. But whoever it is that they don't feel is like pulling their weight or bringing in enough market or whatever, that the value isn't there to keep them along. Do you see that ever happening?
I think you'd really have to have the TV executives push hard, because I don't think the presidents are going to be in favor of that happening. I think the presidents value the legacy programs. They value the academics, and Purdue does bring a lot to the academic side.
For the record, I don't have any issues with Purdue. So
I know. I'm just saying, there are certain teams like that I think the presidents really value in a lot of ways, to say, like, this is getting out of hand if we're kicking, and I'm just continuing to use them because you use them as an example, kicking Purdue out of the conference, or kicking Minnesota out of the conference in some way like that. I don't think it'll ever happen. I don't think they'll ever just outright kick a team out. Do I think that they could maybe be okay with a team leaving for the SEC? Possibly. But I don't think you'll ever see them just like kick a team out and say, you're independent now and you're no longer in the conference. I couldn't see that happening.
Yeah. Well, it'd be wild. It will be interesting.
It would be a historic day in college football if that happened.
Yeah. It is getting scary, and at some point you do start, really losing what college football is all about. So hopefully, I mean, some of that's already happened, but hopefully we don't. It's still fun. I think everyone's still engaged. We love this engagement. That's part of why we love the College Huddle, is to be able to have these conversations with other fan bases and continue to get those perspectives of other teams across the nation, and have these new rivalries and these other and these fun, mashups at this point is what it still feels like. So anyway, well, great. JR, thank you so much for joining us. Please let everybody know where they can find you and all your content.
Yeah, biggest thing is the Big Ten Huddle over at the College Huddle. Look up the College Huddle podcast on YouTube, College Huddle on all social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all those places. We're posting content there for you. as much as we can. And then if you just want to follow me personally, I post a lot of Ohio State stuff. I do some Big Ten stuff, but if you, for whatever reason, want to see somebody go crazy about Ohio State, JR's_rankings on Twitter is where I post a lot of my personal stuff. So you can go there, but that's about all the plug I got.
All right. Well, good. Well, we'll, of course, put all of that in the show notes below. Please like the video, subscribe, go follow JR and all his content, all the College Huddle. You can find most teams across the FBS in the College Huddle, and you can go find your team and get your team, specific content out there. So be sure to go check all that as well. And as always, go Cougs.